So my talk today, I'm going to be talking about spiritually transformative experiences, and I'll be talking from two perspectives. Yes, I'm an NDE researcher, and I have over 38 years of clinical experience as a medical doctor, researching and counseling people who've had diverse kinds of spiritually transformative experiences, whether it's near-death experiences or mystical experiences or Kundalini. But I'm also, as Marcia mentioned, I'm an experiencer myself. How I was propelled into specializing my career in this area was because of my own powerful experiences, particularly a very powerful near-death experience that I had in 1979. Before I go on, are the back doors supposed to be shut? I prefer them shut. Could we shut the rear doors, please? Because there's just people walking back and forth, so it's a bit distracting. I'm also the author of a book, Farther Shores, exploring how near-death, Kundalini, and mystical experiences transform ordinary lives. And this book is available for sale in your bookstore, I believe, or you can order it online. And much of what I'm going to be talking about today is in my book. So if you have unanswered questions at the end of my talk, that's where you should look. So let me tell you how my shift in consciousness began. And that began with a near-death experience that I had in 1979 in a plane crash. So I'm going to tell you the story about this. And just before I tell you the story, I'll say that the first half of today's presentation is going to be me sharing personally many of my stories, my own personal near-death experiences, the spiritually transformative experiences. Then after the break, I'm going to be talking more about how I, as a medical doctor, have come to understand spiritually transformative experiences for all my patients that I've seen over the years, and how my experiences that I told you about, how they sort of fit into what I'm talking about in the second half. So my 1979 near-death experience happened this way. I was a medical resident at that time. I was finishing my residency with the University of Toronto, and where I was specializing in family practice. And I was assigned to work at the Northern Native Indian communities in Northern Ontario for a few weeks as part of my training, actually for a month. And on this particular day, which was March 29th, I was assigned to accompany a critically ill Native Indian woman on a medical evacuation, or a medevac as we now call it, by a small aircraft from the little community where I was working in Sioux Lookout. We were to go to a larger hospital in Winnipeg because her condition was very serious and we didn't have enough equipment or an ICU in this little hospital to look after her. So being the low person on the totem pole as the resident, I was assigned to accompany this woman on the medevac flight. So we went into a small airplane called a Piper Aztec, which is a small twin-engine propeller plane. And it was so small that when the pilot was in the front seat, we had the oxygen tank in the co-pilot seat. We had the two seats behind the pilot pulled out. That's where the patient was on her stretcher, and her feet reached the back of the plane. And then on the second row on the co-pilot side was me, and I was she was intubated, so which meant she had a tube into her airways, and I had to be pressing a bag to keep the air flowing into her lungs. And that the nurse was sitting in the third row, the seat behind me, and she was tending to the intravenousas. She had 2 intravenousas going with drugs, and the plane was full. This is the full plane, so this was the size of a Piper Aztec. We headed off from Kenora, and unfortunately it was middle of winter, the end of March in northern Canada, and we flew into a bad ice and snow storm. So the winds were heavy and the plane was shaking. The inquest afterwards, because there was an inquest, presumed that the ice filters of the 2 engines froze over, and that's what resulted in the crash. But me in the plane tending to the patient, I was thinking about the patient and not really paying that much attention to the weather. then all of a sudden I noticed that if you've ever been in a propeller plane, you know they're very, very noisy. So you can hear the sounds of the engine, particularly in the small plane. All of a sudden I could hear that the right engine was sort of sputtering to a stop. Then I could look out the window and see that one engine was going, but this one was slowing to a stop. So immediately I was concerned, and I shouted up to the pilot, "What's going on? What's happening?" And he was pushing levers and pulling and doing all sorts of things with the equipment, and he managed to get the engine started again. So, okay, so I calmed down. And then I went back to tending the patient, and then all of a sudden I heard a change in the sound of the motors again, and this time it was the left engine was sputtering to a stop. And then as I looked up, then I saw the right engine sputter to a stop. So now we had no engines going. And it was a heavy storm and really strong winds, and if you ever wonder, will you miss it if the plane crashes? No, you will not miss it. There's incredible turbulence as the plane is going down. So it was just being buffeted by the wind, and the pilot was trying to steer the free-falling plane. And I remember my first reaction was intense fear and panic. My instant reaction was, oh God, I'm gonna die. That thought just came out of my consciousness in a flash. And it was right after that thought that my near-death experience began. Suddenly, out of nowhere, it was like this force field descended upon me, and it pushed away all my fear. And I felt peaceful, and I felt calm, and I heard a voice say, "Be still and know that I am God. I am with you now and always." The plane had not crashed yet. I was still very much alive. But somehow now I was in this place of peace, profound calm, and feeling safe in the presence of the divine. The pilot managed to bring the free-falling plane into sort of a guided skid landing onto the surface of the ice of a semi-frozen lake that we've been flying over. But the plane skidded across the ice, and when it came to a stop, it was right at the edge of open water. Believe it or not, we crashed at a place called Devil's Gap. And it's called that because of the strong current. So it's dangerous in the summer or the winter, and we had crashed right at the edge of the ice by the open, fast-moving water of Devil's Gap. So as soon as the plane came to a stop, its weight broke the ice, and it rapidly sank into the water. So we had to get out of the plane and fast. I was still in this incredible state of peace and calm, but I was also very much in my body and knowing that we had to get out of the plane before it sank, and I was trying to pull the patient on her stretcher out of the plane, but was unable to get her stretcher through the angle of the door before the plane nosedived. I did pull the nurse out from the back of the plane. The pilot got out on the other side, and suddenly we found ourselves wearing heavy winter clothes, heavy winter parkas, boots, heavy pants, in ice-cold water with the fast-moving current, and going away from the closest shore, there was ice. We didn't know how thick that ice was, if it could support our weight, which it could not. And ahead of us was a large stretch of fast-moving black water between us and the closest land. And immediately, I heard the voice in my head speak again, and it said, "Swim to shore." Now, I have to say I was inexperienced in paranormal experiences at this time because I argued with the voice. No, I shouldn't swim to shore. I've taken lifeguarding, and if you have a boating accident, you're not supposed to swim to shore. You're supposed to stay where you are because you're going to drown on the swim to shore. And the pilot was saying, "Try to get on the ice, try to get on the ice." So I ignored the voice in my head, and I tried to get on the ice, but it was impossible. I was wearing, as I said, this heavy clothing that just felt like weights dragging me down in the water when it was wet, and I would kick and kick and kick and struggle and try to get my arms on the ice, and as soon as I got any weight on the ice would break and sink into the water. And then I'd try again, and the voice repeated, "Swim to shore." So I ignored it, and I kept on trying to get on the ice, and then the third time, swim to shore. I finally surrendered to the higher wisdom. I hope I've learned a lesson from this in life. Hopefully I have, because that's what saved my life. So I started swimming to shore. Now, it was a very long and an extremely difficult swim. Many people have said that it's a miracle in itself that I was able to swim that distance, being hypothermic, which means frozen, and in the fast-moving current, the distance to shore was something like 200 yards at least to shore. And I went down several times in the process of going to shore, like just out of sheer exhaustion. My body would go under, and my lungs would fill with lake water. But at that sort of desperate moment, somehow all your adrenaline kicks up or something, and you manage to kick yourself up and get your head above water. And then I continued struggling to try to swim to shore. So somewhere in the process of swimming to shore is when my near-death experience deepened. And what happened was, all of a sudden I heard a whooshing noise. It was like whoosh. And all of a sudden, my point of perception was no longer in my body. I mean, I was still swimming. I was still alive. I was still trying to swim to shore. But where I was looking from was that I was above my body and I was looking down. It seemed like I was 20 or 30 feet above my body looking down. And then it's sort of, the best I can compare it is sort of like a split screen TV, where you have a little tiny picture in one corner and the big picture. So the little tiny picture was that little bit of me that was still in the body trying to swim to shore, but most of my consciousness was out of my body and looking down at what was happening below. And then I went higher, and I went into the light. And the light was pure, unconditional, infinite love. It was the most profound and the most beautiful love that I had ever experienced in my life. And when I was in that light and I was permeated with that love, I just somehow knew a lot of things. Not that it was spoken or told to me, but I just knew. I knew that I was experiencing a glimpse, a taste, an embrace of the higher power, what I had been raised to call God. And it was not an old man sitting with a long beard sitting on a throne judging us, but it was more like this infinite force underlying the universe, sustaining the universe, and loving every molecule, every atom, every soul, just as much as I was feeling the love at that minute. And I also knew absolutely that me, whatever me is, would live on no matter what happened to that body down below, whether that body lived or died in the plane crash. And I really didn't care. I was so happy. I was in pure joy. I felt home. And it really did not matter to me what happened to the physical body below. And I also had a sense that this higher power, intelligent, loving force already knew what was going to happen. And it's sort of like watching a television show where somebody else already knows what's going to happen. The producers already have the script and they know the ending. But I was in the position of not knowing. I didn't know what the ordained ending was going to be of this scenario down below. So sort of I watched to see how it was going to unfold. Well, it did not look like I was going to survive, because I just did not have the strength to swim all the distance to shore. And when I was about 15 or 20 feet away from shore, I was absolutely depleted. I had no strength left in me. And it seemed for that instance the split in the split screen TV shifted, so that although I was still in the light, more of my awareness now was down in the body that was about to die. And I remember thinking, it's true. You do die the third time you go down. Weird thoughts you have facing death. And then I surrendered. I was completely willing, accepting, embracing to surrender, to go down for the third time, and to no longer have a bodily existence. But at that moment, as I looked out through my physical eyes, I could see that the current was carrying me very, very rapidly to the right. And I was, as I said, about 20 to 30 feet from the shore. And there was a tall pine tree that had fallen into the water, projecting into the water from the shore of this island that I'd swum to. And the current was carrying me towards this pine tree. And in the mystical state that I was in, it actually looked to me like there was an etheric hand of light superimposed on that pine tree, reaching out to me. And that all I had to do was swim 1 or 2 more strokes, and then boom, my hand hit that tree. And that's exactly what happened. And I managed to pull myself along that tree onto the shore. I called out to the nurse and the pilot who were still in the water, swim to shore, you can do it. Then I instinctively got into a crouch position with my frozen fingers in my armpit, and I started more and more floating further and further away from my body. Now, there were a whole series of coincidences, if you believe in coincidences, that led to my rescue that day, that led to our rescue. Where we had swum to was an island with open water in front of it and no road access. So you couldn't get to it by skidoo, you couldn't get to it by boat, you couldn't get to it by road. The only way you could possibly get to where we were would be by helicopter. And normally there was no helicopter anywhere near where we had the crash. But by coincidence, that day, there was a helicopter that had been flying from somewhere in Manitoba, and it was going to Quebec, but it got, because of the bad weather, it set down at a base about 5 miles from where we had crashed. And it had just set down, and the radio was still on. And the fellow at the base who had the radio on, they picked up the message. Now, hear about the message. Because of where we went down, as the plane was sinking, the pilot radioed out a mayday that we had crashed. But because of the hills and the weather and the storm, that the only way anybody would have picked up that mayday message would be if by some chance a plane was flying almost directly overhead so that they'd be able to pick up the message. But sure enough, on that day, it was a big commercial Air Canada jet from somewhere, Edmonton they say, to maybe Toronto, that was flying almost directly overhead and picked up the message almost approximately where we crashed. And it radioed that message down to the ground, so to whoever could receive it. And this helicopter that had just landed and the fellow in the base where he just landed both heard the message. Bob and Brian were their 2 first names. They'd never met before. They just instinctively, the 2 of them, got into the helicopter and immediately went out and started looking for us. And they came almost exactly to the right location very, very quickly. Unfortunately, because except for right there, everything was frozen solid. So they were looking for wreckage. They were looking for wreckage in the trees, or they were looking for wreckage on the ice. Like there should be some evidence of a plane having gone down. Who would think that on the one spot where there's open water would be the spot where our plane went down? So at first they flew by and didn't see us at all, and they came by later. They saw maybe a cushion or something floating in the water. Anyway, to cut a long story short, and I have more details of this in my book, they did finally find us huddled under the trees, and they managed to find a spot where they could bring down the helicopter just barely, and then Bob got out of the plane and sort of half carried me, half dragged me, because I was semi-conscious at best, into the helicopter, and then they flew us to Kenora Hospital, which was the closest hospital. They landed the helicopter on the driveway of the hospital, and then they took us, I remember watching as they wheeled my body on a little gurney into the hospital emergency room. Now, unbelievably, back in the 70s, doctors and nurses were not really well trained in the treatment of hypothermia. So when we got brought into the emergency room, I was profoundly hypothermic. I remember watching from above as a nurse tried to take my temperature with the standard thermometer, and she was going, there must be something wrong with this thermometer, I'm not getting a reading. But the problem was my body temperature was below the bottom reading of a standard thermometer. That's how cold I was. Yeah. And then as I watched from above, I could feel my consciousness floating further and further away. And then all of a sudden, I observed as these words came out of my mouth, my body's mouth, boy, could I use a hot bath. And like, I had not thought of that. I was up there in the light. But this is what came out of my mouth. And the nurses, I think, they laughed like you did. They thought perhaps I was regaining consciousness or something. But then they went, gee, maybe that would help them. Maybe we should take them to the physiotherapy department and put them in the hot whirlpool baths. So they wheeled us down to the physiotherapy department, and it was there when they finally took off my ice-encrusted clothes and put my frozen body in the hot whirlpool bath that I felt my consciousness re-enter my body. And what that felt like was like this. It felt like I'd been in this big expanded place up above, and suddenly and abruptly, again with the whooshing noise, I was sucked into the tiny confines of my body. I'd imagine it would be like you see on TV, a genie being sucked into a tiny bottle. It felt like that. Just suddenly I was back in my body. And then I knew I was back. I remember sitting there in the whirlpool baths. My fingers were so frozen I had no sensation at all, but I was rubbing my arms and rubbing my legs, and I was saying, I'm back, I'm going to live, I'm going to live. You know, and I presume the nurses thought I was delirious or something like that. But that is the story of my 1979 near-death experience. Now, when this happened to me, I had no idea what this was. I returned to Toronto several days. I was only in hospital for a day or two, and then I had to be off work for about a month. And I was intoxicated with love after this. During that month, I just felt my heart bursting with love. I would look at the squirrels playing in the yard, and I would just feel love, profound love for the squirrels. I would see children playing in the street, and oh, my heart would just be oozing with love for the children. Music on the radio, I mean, any theme, oh, it's about love, you know, oh, it's about parents, oh, it's about everything seemed to just bubble up this love inside of me. And it was beautiful. It was wonderful, but I did not know what to even call what had happened to me. In all my medical training and all my life as a person growing up in a traditional Christian home, I had no word to describe what had happened to me. So when I went back to work, I started talking to some of my medical colleagues, some of the doctors that I work with. And I remember us being huddled around a big table in the doctor's dining room, and I was telling them what had happened to me during the plane crash, about the out-of-body experience and the light and the love. And I remember my colleagues and friends, they knew I wasn't crazy. They knew I had very high marks and I was a very good doctor. So everybody came up with a biological explanation. So, you know, it must have been a low blood sugar, you know, or an electrolyte imbalance that made you hallucinate, and a direct effect of cold on the brain. Those were the three most popular theories of this. And none of that rang true to me. I mean, absolutely not. This was profound. This was positive. This had changed me. In addition to this love, incredible love I felt the first month, I completely lost my fear of death. I absolutely knew that God was not this judge up there judging us. I knew to the core of my being that the same one loving power is the same God that all religions of the world are trying to wrestle with. We all have partial and incomplete understanding. I just knew this to be true. Not only that, and what I didn't tell my doctor friends, is I also started having psychic experiences after this. I started having clairvoyant episodes, and one of the ones I write in my book is I was driving to visit a friend one day after work, and I suddenly get a clear mental image of her brain covered in pus. And to me, as a doctor, it was clearly a visual image that represented meningitis. And as it turned out, when I went to visit her, she did have a strange headache, she was feeling sick, and later on that night she was diagnosed with a rare type of meningitis. And I had told her about my vision. I said, if you get sicker, please go to the Emerge and say a doctor friend wants you to be checked for meningitis. Don't say why, but just say that a doctor friend wants you to be checked for meningitis. And she was, and she started treatment, and she fully recovered. So this had changed me profoundly in deep and significant ways, and I absolutely knew that low blood sugars and a low potassium would not cause this sort of change. So I was in a quandary. Finally, I found a medical colleague who was a very devout Christian, and he said to me, you know, Yvonne, I think you've had a mystical experience. And then finally it was like, ding, yeah, that fits. I had a mystical experience when I was close to death. I did read about near-death experiences back then, but I was told by a supposed expert on near-death experiences that you cannot have a near-death experience unless you were clinically dead. So because I was never clinically dead at any time during the experience, and in fact it started before the plane crashed and while I was swimming to shore, I was affirmatively told it was not a near-death experience. So now I can tell all of you, all these years later, it was definitely a near-death experience. And my research and the research of others like Ken Ring and Bruce Grayson have shown that near-death experiences, yes, they can occur when you're clinically dead. They can occur when you're close to death physically, but they can also occur when you're facing death psychologically. And that is what happened to me. So that was my first NDE. So I, after this, became a spiritual seeker. Now we're getting back to my slide, the second point here. I privately and in the closet and very separate from my work as a medical doctor, started researching mystical experiences, psychic experiences, Kundalini Awakening, you'll understand why in a minute, and near-death experiences. I was looking at the whole gamut of spiritual and paranormal experiences, trying to understand what was happening to me. Then 10 years later, it took 10 years of sort of private searching. Then I had another experience that I'm not going to talk about in length today, but it was a very powerful, what I call my calling experience, where I was walking on the sand dunes in Monterey, California, just being profoundly moved by the horror stories I'd heard from so many people who had spiritual experiences and had been mistreated by the medical profession, who'd been told that they had a psychotic illness, who'd been hospitalized, who'd been given shock treatment, who'd been given medications. I was horrified and deeply, deeply moved by the stories that I'd heard. And then it was like this white light descended upon me from above, and my being became this blaze of light, and nothing was said, but I knew to the core of my being that I now had to go public, that this was my moral and spiritual responsibility to speak out and say, these people are not crazy, and we medical doctors, I'm one of you, we have to stop treating people who have spiritual experiences as if they were mentally ill. And not only that, but I had to disclose, I had to come out of the closet, that I too have had a mystical experience. I too have had a near-death experience, and I'm not crazy. So I'm convinced both by my personal experience and also by the experiences of my many patients. So that is how, oops, I don't know why it says next in the corner. Told you we might have technical
Just click
problems.
on the screen.
Anyway, let's go to the next one. Hello, not cooperating.
Click on the screen.
Just click on the screen. Anywhere on your screen, it should make that menu drop.
Just click.
Click next.
Yeah, you can do that. Yeah, there we go.
Anyway, here we go. We're moving on to the next slide. So, so the end of the last slide that we didn't get to finish was that became my medical specialty. Let's see if this works now. There we go. Okay, that became my medical specialty. From 1990 onwards, I announced in Toronto, the University of Toronto, and then internationally as I started traveling and speaking to conferences, that my medical specialty was counseling and researching patients who'd had near-death experiences and other sorts of spiritually transformative experiences. And I was, in fact, the first Canadian medical doctor to specialize in this area. You've had a few in the US, but I was the first Canadian doctor to specialize in this area. So, as I started learning more about near-death experiences and other spiritual experiences, I realized, and it took me a really long time to realize, I didn't realize this for a good 20, maybe 25 years, that I, in fact, had also had a near-death experience when I was a child of 11. And I'll tell you very briefly my childhood NDE experience. My family was driving in our family station wagon. We were actually moving to Los Angeles, California as a family. We had green cards and we were moving to the US. And we had a very serious car accident. And that was the days before seatbelts. So I was in the back seat of the station wagon with my brothers and my sister. My parents were in the front seat. And there was, we think, a flat tire, and somehow the car was going fast. That went down a deep embankment at the side of the road, and it spun a couple times over on its hood before it came to a rest. And I was just a child. I had just turned 11, and I was thrown into the packed luggage compartment where all the suitcases were. And so I sustained some sort of a head injury while the car was spiraling over. Now, the next memory that I have, I remember the lurch of the car, but the next memory that I have, and I've always had this very clear memory, ever since my childhood, was somehow floating above where my father was on the roadside, where the people who had pulled him out of the wreck, which had laid him on the roadside waiting for the ambulance to come. And my father, he later recounted the story to me that he noticed that I was missing. They thought that they pulled everyone out of the car. They didn't know there was a child amongst all the suitcases in the crumpled up back part of the station wagon. So they hadn't found me, and everyone else was lying at the side of the road. And my dad kept on saying, even though he was gravely injured, "My daughter, my daughter." And it feels to me now, as I'm looking back, that my soul must have sensed that my father was calling out to me, which is why my soul, which was out of body, clearly remembers being above my dad as he was calling out my daughter. Then the next thing I've always remembered since I was 11 years old was floating above the emergency room. And my body was lying on an emergency room table, and I remember looking down, there were two men huddled over my body. I assumed they were doctors trying to resuscitate me. And I remember seeing the top side of those big, round, curved, silver, metallic operating room lamps. Now, as an 11-year-old, I don't think I'd ever seen one of those, and I wasn't seeing it from the bottom like a child would. I was seeing it from the top, looking down at it. And so I looked down, and I clearly could see the top of this lamp, and then the doctors trying to resuscitate me. Then my next memory is several days later. I have very clear and distinct memories of when I regained consciousness. I was unconscious for several days, and waking up and figuring out where I was in a hospital, etc. So I now realize that this too was a near-death experience. I didn't know any better when I was 11. I just thought this is what happens to everybody. You know, if you've had a head injury or been in a car accident. I didn't think it was anything special or unusual or that you would even talk to somebody about. But now it's like, hey, that was an out-of-body experience, and these are memories of being out of body. And the other thing is that after this experience, I remember for the first year after this car accident and head injury, I could see ghosts. And I would see like wraith-like figures moving in the darkness, particularly at night. And how I interpreted this as a child, I didn't know it had anything to do with my head injury and NDE, was I thought our house was haunted. And so I told my parents, our house was haunted, our house was haunted. And they probably thought I was just upset about the move or upset about the accident or whatever, but I refused to sleep in my own bedroom. I insisted that my bed be wheeled into the room where my younger brother and sister slept because I was afraid to sleep alone. And this ability to see spirits lasted for maybe about a year, and then it went away. But now, as an NDE researcher, I know that that's a very common side effect to people who've had the out-of-body type of near-death experience. So I realized, holy mackerel, I had my first near-death experience when I was a child. Then, as I started thinking more, I realized, a few years before my NDE, I in fact had a Kundalini Awakening. Now, again, I didn't know that's what it was when it happened to me. I just thought this was something that happened to people that meditated. And so I'll describe to you what happened to me. I had taken a meditation course. I was in my final year of medical school at the time, and this meditation course had advertised that if you learned how to meditate, this would improve your marks and you'd do better on your exams. And of course, I wanted to pass all my licensing exams, etc. So I took this meditation course, not even trying to be spiritual or have any experiences, but thought it would help me with my exams. And so this happened about a month after I started meditating regularly. So I was meditating 45 minutes to an hour twice a day, in the morning and in the evening, to relax and to help my memory. All of a sudden, while I was meditating this one evening, I heard a roaring noise. This one was like a roaring noise, sort of like the sound of a waterfall. I heard, and I felt this energy rise up the back of my body, and then my consciousness popped out of my head and I expanded. It was as if me was no longer the size of my head and body, but that me was the size of the auditorium I was in. It was maybe about twice the size of this auditorium. And it's that it seemed like I, whatever I is, was that size, but not only that I had somehow transformed into pure and profound, unconditional love. So it was like I was this force field of love. And I remained in that expanded state of love until my meditation ended. And then when my meditation ended, there was sort of a contraction and a experience with energy coming back down. Now, at the time, I was only 23. I thought that I had finally figured out how to meditate. And then I was embarrassed because I thought, here I am, this supposedly smart person who'd gone to medical school and was graduating, and it took me so long to figure out how to meditate right. Like I figured all the other meditators were having this each time they meditated, and that I was a slow learner in terms of meditation. So I was embarrassed about it, and I didn't talk to anybody about it, and I tried to reproduce this experience when I meditated, but I was not able to. And so finally, after several weeks, I spoke with one of the senior meditators, and I told him, I said, I don't know what I'm doing wrong, that I'm not meditating right in some way because I'm not able to reproduce this experience that I had. And so when I described the experience, this more experienced meditator, his jaw sort of dropped. He looked at me and he said, wow, that sounds like a Kundalini awakening. But that can't possibly be what happened to you, because that only happens to really advanced meditators and to saints, and if you get it, you're supposed to be a genius immediately afterwards. So a whole bunch of misinformation. So again, I was invalidated, just like I was invalidated about my near-death experience. Couldn't possibly have been a near-death experience because I wasn't dead. And this one couldn't possibly have been a Kundalini awakening because I was, too young or too unadvanced or something like that. But after that experience, I started regularly having experiences of rushes of energy going up my spine, which continue to this day. And also various inner sounds, which are very typical of people who have awakened the Kundalini mechanism. I will be describing it later. So as I started researching spiritual experiences, I didn't limit my research to just to near-death experiences because of my own variety of experiences, and also thinking that my plane crash experience was a mystical experience. I started researching mystical experiences, psychic phenomenon, and Kundalini Awakening, just in case that Kundalini Awakening really was a Kundalini Awakening, which it was. Well, much to my surprise, in 1995, I had another near-death experience. Now, this again happened in an airplane, so some people say to me, I don't know if it's good or bad to fly with you. Basically, what happened this time? So in 1995, I had traveled to Edmonton. I did a lot of travel in the 90s, speaking all over Canada, some in the United States, and sometimes in Europe, about near-death experiences, Kundalini, spiritually transformative experiences, mystical experiences, that they were normal, healthy, and people were not crazy who had them. And I was flying back from, I had published my earlier book, A Farther Shore, which is before the one that we have here, Farther Shores. And I was flying back from having spoken at a conference in Edmonton, and I was in a large Air Canada commercial jet flying from Edmonton to Toronto. And we flew into an ice storm. And I remember thinking, interesting, yeah, my plane crashed back in '79, that was in an ice storm too. And then I looked at the date on the newspaper I was reading, and to my eyes, it looked like it said March 27th. And I thought, March 27th? I told you the incorrect date earlier on. March 27th, 1979 was my first near-death experience in the plane crash. And so when I saw March 27th, what am I doing flying in an ice storm on March 27th? I mean, this surely can't be March 27th. And I kept blinking my eyes and looking at the newspaper. And finally, like before my eyes, the letters sort of shifted around. And then it came to the correct date, which was in fact February 27th. So it gave me a little bit of a shake. And then as we were finally coming down and approaching Toronto Airport, we had flown into an ice storm, and ice was forming on the wings of the plane. I had a window seat, so I could see the ice forming on the wings of the plane. And I know that they always de-ice planes before you take off, so this must not be a good thing that ice is forming on the wings of the plane, which I later found out is not a good thing. So we're finally coming down so that we're going to land, and I was sort of breathing a sigh of relief. I could see the runway lights ahead of us, that, all these thoughts about the old plane crash just must be me being spooked or something. And then all of a sudden, within view of the runway below us, the pilot of the plane slammed the flaps of the aircraft in the opposite direction. He raced his engines. They were screaming. He was trying to abort the landing at the last minute. And the plane was shaking like crazy, and everybody started, oh my God. People were saying, I'm going to die. And people were throwing up, and it really looked like we were going to crash. And I just went into this incredible place of calm. I get it. I was meant to live through that last plane crash, do my work, write my book, which I had, and I'm going to die today. And I had learned, well, if you're going to die, the best way to die is consciously. Go for the light, go straight for the light, don't stop anywhere in between. So I decided to consciously die. And so I went deep into meditation and strived to go to the light. And my near-death experience began immediately. My only attachment was my young son, and I prayed for God to please look after my son. And then I just went out of body, and all of a sudden my spirit was traveling up that dark tunnel. This was the only NDE really where I experienced the dark tunnel. And I'm going up through this dark tunnel, but this time it's like I'm pushing. It's not only is the light lifting me, but I'm pushing, I'm trying to go. I know where I'm headed, I'm going for that light. And I was pushing with my soul. I was intently trying to go up to that light, to get back to that light. And then I had a life review. This is the only NDE of the ones that I had where I experienced a life review, where suddenly it was like stones skipping on the surface of water, but I was skipping through time. And it was almost as if I traveled back in time and I was reliving for a short period of time the three peak experiences that I re-experienced. And for me, they were peak spiritual experiences. So I re-experienced being in the white light in my plane crash of 1979. I re-experienced my white light mystical calling experience that made it clear to me that I was to now go public, and this was to be my career work. And then I had a third mystical experience I had later on in my life that I haven't shared. I briefly re-experienced that. And then I continued moving upwards, and the light was now turning into this beautiful, deep, luminescent blue. It was no longer sort of blackish dark, it was bluish dark. And I kept pushing upward, and all of a sudden, appearing in front of me and blocking my upward progress was a being of light. And this being of light was also luminescent, translucent, deep blue. And this being of light had the most extraordinary appearance, because it looked like, later on I've seen statues from yoga of the dancing Shiva, a figure that has 4 arms and 1 leg raised dancing. This is how this figure looked. It had 4 arms, and they were held in an unusual pose, and this was not something I was familiar with at that time. And 1 leg was raised as if in a dancing posture, and it also seemed to be half male and half female. I mean, quite extraordinary. I've never seen anything like this. And it communicated with me telepathically, and it simply said, "It is not your time." And boom, just like that, my consciousness was back in my body, in the plane that hadn't crashed yet, that the pilot was still trying to get it, and it was still shaking like crazy, and people were still screaming and crying and throwing up. But the plane eventually did manage to come up. I later learned that all the ice on the wings made the plane much heavier, and because they slowed down, the plane slowed down when they're about to land. He didn't have enough speed, and the plane was much heavier because of the ice, and that's why it was so hard for him to take off again. And he had to abort the landing because coyotes were on the runway. So anyway, yes, I looked that up in my Native Indian totem book, and there was a meaning to it. So this near-death experience also changed me, but very, very differently from how my other ones changed me. When the plane finally came to a stop and I got off at Toronto International Airport, I felt like I had no skin. It felt like the barrier between me and the world around me had just gone. It was like I was naked, is how it felt. And then that night I had a very, very deep sleep. And when I woke up the next morning, I was in a state of communion. I was in a state, it felt like I did not have a top of my head anymore. And where the top of my head used to be, I was now connected to that infinite, loving intelligence force behind the universe, that ocean of consciousness that I call God. And I remained in that state for approximately 2 months. And you might say, oh, that's a very grandiose thing to say, but really there is nothing grandiose about being in communion at all. In fact, it's an incredibly humbling experience, because while in that state, I was totally aware that everybody, every living being is absolutely as connected and as loved as I was. The difference was I could feel it. I was experiencing it. That veil that blinds us normally from our oneness with the divine had been removed. And I didn't need to ask anybody what I was experiencing. I knew exactly what I was experiencing. And there's a saying in yoga, it goes, before enlightenment, chopping wood and hauling water. After enlightenment, chopping wood and hauling water. And that's exactly how it was. I did my day-to-day routine, I looked after my young son, I did grocery shopping, drove to work, saw my patients, everything while in this state of communion. There was no need, no desire to tell anybody. It was, and it was wonderful, and I was home, and it was a blessing. And while in that state, I had incredible, incredible intuition. It was information would be brought to me before I even knew I needed the information. And so my intellect, the role of my intellect was to do whatever my spirit knew had to be done. Like, for example, as patients would come into my office and I did psychotherapy, spiritually oriented psychotherapy of people with STEs. And they would walk in my room. Before they opened their mouth, I knew what their psychological or spiritual issues were that they were wrestling with right now. And I absolutely knew how to help them before they opened their mouth. It was incredible. But as the 2 months went on, I found my consciousness started to contract, and I would have to meditate. I'd have to go into meditation, get really still, and focus my consciousness here at the third eye region, and then I would pop back into the communion, into that expansive place. But as the 2 months progressed, it got more and more difficult for me to get back into communion. And then finally, at the end of the 2 months, I was not able to re-enter that state. And that communion is what I have been striving for ever since. Now, this near-death experience obviously changed me in a very different way from the others. Oh, we're at completely the wrong near-death experience. I'm sorry. That's the one. It changed me in a completely different way from the others, because now I knew that this state of communion that people talk about is real, and it's achievable even for people like me. That it's not just some pie-in-the-sky thing that only happens to great saints and mystics. So it created an incredible spiritual yearning in me. Now, because you saw my next slide already, I'm going to quickly tell you this before we go to break. Is that all right? Okay. That unbelievably to me, and quite remarkably, then 8 years after that, I had yet another near-death experience. And this is the one where I had my traumatic brain injury. And because we're a little short on time and it's break time, I'll speed the story of this. Is that the correct time up there? Yes, it is. Basically, I was meditating at Niagara Falls. I love meditating there because the roar of the waterfalls, I like to go underneath in the tunnels, and to me it's like the own vibration, and it helps me go very deep in my meditation very quickly. So that night when I meditated there, I had a profound, deep, beautiful meditation, and I made it home again. I made it back into that communion. And a being of light, a saint from my tradition, appeared to me in his light body and telepathically communicated to me, "Welcome home." And I felt such joy. And I remember saying to my friend that was with me that evening, we went and ate dinner afterwards overlooking the falls, that I don't know how long this is going to last, because the previous time it had only lasted 2 months. But now that I've been able to find my way back home again, I know it's possible. I will be able to find my way back home again. Anyway, 2 hours later, I died. So now I wonder if that period was actually what we call deathbed experiences or end-of-life experiences, where the veils are short, are removed when people are about to die, because I died 2 hours later. I don't know, or was it karmically my time to have communion again? Don't know, but I find that very interesting. I'm calling it my deathbed experience. And I had a slip and fall accident, hit my head, had a very serious traumatic brain injury, multiple injuries to my brain hemorrhage, and I instantly died. And what happened was my consciousness was whisked out of my body so fast by a power greater than my own, very, very rapidly through the darkness, almost a millisecond, and then I was suddenly in the light. And I was being welcomed into the light by two beings of light. The being of light the saint who had said, welcome home, but now another saint from my tradition, the two of them telepathically welcoming me home. And it felt like a celebration in heaven, a celebration in the light, like a graduation party. And it was telepathically communicated to me that my work in the body of Dr. Yvonne Kason was done, that I had died, implied job well done. On any of my goofs or failings or shortcomings wasn't even mentioned. It was like it was irrelevant. And I was welcomed joyously into the light. And while in the light, for what I call timeless time, because time does not seem to pass the same as it does here on earth, many things are revealed to me. Some things that I remember and other things that I have difficulty remembering, and other things that are just virtually impossible to put in linear thought, because it wasn't communicated to me in linear thought. It was sort of like all at once. Like a veil that had been blocking my ability to perceive all my past lives was suddenly removed, and I could see all, the jigsaw puzzle. Suddenly the veil is pulled away, and I could see how everything fit together, and suddenly my life and the strange course it had and all those STEs that I had, it all made sense in terms of my life over many lifetimes. It all fit together. So it was a major aha experience. And then after a period of timeless time, the beings of light appeared to me again and telepathically said to me, you may now choose whether to return to the maimed body of Dr. Yvonne Kason to further serve the divine there, or to reincarnate in the body of a babe and further serve there. And I'm going to cut the story short here. My heart and soul responded. The intellect is like, I don't know where it was, gone somewhere. When you're in the light and in the bliss and in the love, it's your heart and soul that responds. And my heart and soul instantly responded, please guide me. What is the higher choice? And it was telepathically communicated back to me, oh so sweetly, oh so gently. How a telepathic thought can be sweet and gentle, I do not know, but it was sweet, it was gentle, like a caress. And said, it will be more difficult, but to return, meaning back to the injured, dead body. And my heart and soul instantly responded, I accept. And faster than the speed of thought, between the I and the accept, is when I woke up in my dead body with a gasp of air. So I, and then gasp of air, and then I thought accept. That was how fast it happened, faster than the speed of thought. And it was like waking up in an ice cube. My body temperature had dropped so much. I was outdoors and it was winter. And as I was lying there, slowly gathering my thoughts, for the first few minutes, I could see both sides perfectly clear. I could see the physical world where I was now, coming back to life in a physical body. And I could see the white light realm as if they were superimposed on each other. And I could see the two angelic beings of light. It's like they ushered me into my body to re-embody. And then slowly, after a few minutes, the white light realm faded from view until it was just a little spot. And I've always felt it was just this little spot that my consciousness could still feel the love of the white light realm. And that was like a life ring for me through the stormy seas that I had to go through afterwards because of my disability. I was disabled. I had a serious traumatic brain injury. I was forced, because of this injury, to completely let go of life as I knew it. I could no longer work as a doctor. I could no longer be an author. I could no longer be a researcher. I could no longer do speaking engagements. I could no longer volunteer in my son's school. I was completely knocked out with physical and cognitive disabilities. But I think, one of the blessings of the near-death experience was I so knew that this was not a punishment. I so knew that this was not bad karma, like some people said to me afterwards rather cruelly. And I knew that God's plan was perfect. I didn't understand it. I didn't need to understand it. I knew God's plan was perfect. And so I think that helped me with my transition. Very quickly, then we're going to break. And sure enough, in 2016, God revealed that they had more work for me to do. Because in 2016, when I was meditating deeply, I had yet another type of STE, a spontaneous healing experience. And what I accepted that all my work, public speaking, writing, everything was behind me. That was the past life. Now I was a disabled person. I was a meditator. I prayed for people. That's what I did. That's all I was able to do. And I'm not going to minimize that. Prayer for people is very important. And I really embraced that was the way that Spirit was calling me to serve now. And I accepted that, and I embraced it fully. But all of a sudden, deep in my meditation, it was like a volcano, a fountain of light erupted in my head. And this light, I could see the light streaming into my brain, and at the same time, it felt like a part of my brain that had been asleep for 12 years since the traumatic brain injury suddenly awoke. And what happened at the same time is my inspired writing creativity awoke. And ideas for my next books were just flooding me. Like the floodgates have opened. They've been backed up now for 12 years. And just the ideas were flowing and flowing and flowing and flowing and flowing. And this healing has been sustained. In the first year after that healing experience, I wrote 2 new books. They're currently out looking for a publisher. Ken Ring and Bruce Grayson are 2 of the people who've reviewed my new books, and they say they're awesome, Yvonne, they're great, so I'm not writing garbage. And even Ken said he thought it was better than my old writing, since this dramatic healing. And I'm now speaking again, and you are group number 2. Now, but I wanted to share this experience before we go to break because it's a testimonial to the fact that the brain can heal. Neuroplasticity has just been discovered, and I am a living testimonial to neuroplasticity of the brain 12 years after my traumatic brain injury to have a dramatic healing like that has been sustained. Number 2, it's a testimonial to the healing power of meditation, because I really focused on my meditation during these years, and it was a struggle because I lost my ability to meditate at first, but I really focused on my meditation, and the top brain experts, I spoke with Dr. Norman Doidge, some of you may know who he is, he's the top Canadian expert on neuroplasticity. He says he thinks it was my meditation, and I think it was number 3. I think it was God. I think it was the grace of God that stimulated the neuroplasticity, and my meditation maybe set the fertile grounds. So all things are possible with Spirit. And with that, we'll break for a break. So now we're going to move on to spiritually transformative experiences. And some of the pearls, if I can use a pun with our next speaker, that I've learned over the years relating to spiritually transformative experiences. Now, based on my research and counseling, close to 1,000 people who've had diverse types of experiences, and my own multiple different types of experiences, I felt that there was a need for an umbrella term that could embrace these diverse experiences. And I coined the phrase spiritually transformative experiences back in my earlier book, A Farther Shore, back in 1994. And the thing that is unique about the spiritual experiences that I umbrella under spiritually transformative experiences is that they all tend to propel the experiencer into a more spiritual belief system, value system, and they all tend to initiate what I call a long-term process of spiritual transformation of consciousness. It's not like you just have an experience and then, okay, forget about that, put that in the closet. It keeps on changing you. So this is a long-term spiritual transformation process. Now, according to how I classify spiritually transformative experiences, I use these 5 general groups. And this very much draws on yogic model. In yoga, there is a clear distinction made between a mystical experience, various types of mystical experiences, and psychic phenomena. So mystical experiences are called samadhis, and psychic phenomena are called siddhis, and in Buddhism it's called iddhis. And these are 2 different categories of experience, but they have many subcategories under them. Also, there is the spiritual energy, the Kundalini Awakening. I'm going to be describing all of these in more detail, but right now I'm giving you the categories. Inspired creativity and genius. And the final category is the death-related STEs. In classical yoga and Buddhism, they don't have a category called near-death experiences, but because here in the West there's been so much focus on near-death experiences and death-related experiences, I put this as a category also, although it overlaps with the others. So, I also think it is very important, and I tried to do this in my book, to have a vocabulary, to have words, because a lot of people have an experience and they don't even know what to call it. I mean, look at what happened to me. I mean, I didn't know when I was a kid that was a near-death experience, or when I had that meditation experience where the roar of the energy moving through my body and I expanded the size of the room and became love. I didn't know what that was. And similarly, my near-death experience, for years and years and years, I thought it was a mystical experience, which it was. But now we can say it was a near-death type of mystical experience. The other thing is, because many people are still being mislabeled and pathologized and told that it's a flight of imagination, it's a hallucination, or it's a sign of mental illness, we need to have an alternative vocabulary that becomes more and more familiar to people so they can say, no, this is not a hallucination, it's called a mystical vision. And here's Dr. Kason's book, you can read about it, Doctor. So what are the types of mystical experiences? So in my work with patients and in my readings, I come to classify mystical experiences into 7 broad types, and I'm going to describe them briefly for you. And some people who have a particular type of near-death experience, or mystical experience, they want to create a new category that this is all by itself, is different from all the others. I don't think that's very helpful. I think it's more helpful to say it's a type of mystical experience, or it's a type of psychic experience, or it's a type of near-death experience, and keep the large categories with a lot of subcategories underneath it. So what are the types of mystical experiences? The first type is what I call the unitive experience. So a unitive experience is an experience of union with the divine, an experience where you feel like your consciousness has become one with the divine. And the 2 months that I was in communion after that near-miss plane crash, that was a unitive experience where I felt my consciousness was one with, was united with, was in union with the higher power. Other people can have that in transient experiences, say related to meditation, or just an isolated incident where they feel their oneness, their union with the higher power. Other people can have, all mystical experiences can be from a very grand scale to a medium scale to even a smaller scale. So some people will feel a smaller experience of union, where they might experience union with their loved one, the feeling like their energy and their loved one's energy have merged as one energy field. And that would be a smaller type of unitive mystical experience. Other people have described to me scenes of nature, beautiful scene of nature, and all of a sudden they feel like they have just merged with and become one with, or in union with this beautiful scene of nature. So these are unitive type of mystical experiences. The second category I call the ecstatic or the bliss episodes. And these are the mystical experiences where it's very much a heartfelt experience. And it's a heartfelt experience of the divine love, a heart sense experience of the divine joy, a heartfelt experience of rapture, of bliss. Sometimes it's peace. And so very much on a feeling level, but profound joy, ecstasy, bliss. But it's rather than a feeling of union, it's the emotional feeling of the joy or the bliss or the ecstasy or the rapture. The third kind, the mystical vision, is a much more visual type of mystical experience. So this can be someone having a visual experience of the white light, as happens with many people in near-death experiences, which white light near-death experiences are a type of mystical experience. So visual experience of seeing the light, of seeing angelic beings of light, of seeing saints. Somebody asked me during the break, how do you know the difference between an angelic being of light and, say, an extraterrestrial? And I said, this is a serious question. That there is a profound difference, and what it is how it feels. Okay, so that extraterrestrial experience is people feel scared, they feel frightened, confused, don't know what's going on. A number of unpleasant emotional reactions. Whereas with a mystical vision, the way it feels is profoundly wonderful. You know in your heart that this is an angelic being, a being of light that is emanating love, that is emanating goodness, that is emanating healing. So on a feeling level, you can completely feel the difference, even though it's a very strong visual experience. And some people also describe learning all sorts of lessons and seeing complex things like schools in the ethers, and that's very, very visual. So I would call that type of visual experience a mystical experience where there's a strong visual component as a mystical vision type of mystical experience. Then there is the next group, which are the expansive episodes. And this is where people experience, as I did in my Kundalini Awakening, that I seem to expand from the size of me to the size of the auditorium. But in other mystical experiences, other people may feel they expand to the size of the world, or to the size of the universe, or to the size of the cosmos, beyond all time, that there's this feeling of expansion. So that category, that group of mystical experiences, I call the expansive episodes. Next we have the spiritual rebirth or religious conversion experiences. And these are experiences that if you're from a Christian background, you can relate to Paul on the road to Damascus. So that having a strong mystical experience that results in an immediate and complete roundabout change in your spiritual orientation. Now you might think that only happens in the Bible and doesn't really happen to people today. No, it does happen to people today, and I have had people write me and people tell me about, literally walking home and being stopped by the light and having a profound mystical experience which changed them from an atheist agnostic who laughed and ridiculed at people who believed in God, then all of a sudden they become a person of the cloth. They become a clergy, that they're now trying to convince everyone that the higher power is real. So that's the spiritual rebirth, religious conversion type of experience. The next category is what I call the revelations or illumination type of experience. And I would say in the near-death experience in 2003, when I was in the light, that would be an example of a revelation type of experience where much was revealed to me all at once. So this would reveal, revelation, that new knowledge, new information, but it's not transmitted linearly the way that our intellect learns. It's sort of like all at once, big lump of understanding comes in a revelation mystical experience. And many people have described this type of experience. And the last category is what I call the dissolution experience, which comes from the word dissolve. And this is very, very difficult to describe, but these are profound mystical experiences where the individual, what is I, seems to dissolve, and all that is I am that I am. That the I has dissolved into the ocean of I am. And again, you might think, boy, that sounds pretty far out. People aren't having that. But no, people have told me about this type of mystical experience. The next type of STE is the spiritual energy or Kundalini episode. And so some of you, this might seem a little bit unfamiliar if you've never heard the word Kundalini, but in different mystical traditions, if you go in the different faiths, mystical traditions, they virtually all have some sort of spiritual energy mentioned. And it might be called Holy Spirit or Holy Wind or Chi or some other similar word, Dumo. Kundalini is in the yogic tradition. And people maybe when they first read it think it's a metaphor, like what is the Holy Spirit? I don't know, that it's a metaphor for something that we just don't understand. But in yoga and in my work in counseling people with spiritually transformative experiences, many people have an STE which has a very strong physical energy component where they feel an energy moving through their body. Like I told you in my Kundalini Awakening, that I heard a loud roaring noise. Like I heard a loud roaring noise, and I felt the energy moving up my body. And then it culminated, of course, in the mystical experience I had. But the energy sensation moving through my body was very clear and very distinct. And this is typical of a Kundalini, Holy Spirit, Holy Wind experience, is that there's a physical sensation of energy moving through the body. Classically, it's up sort of through the back of the body. To me, it felt like almost my whole body that the energy was moving up. Sometimes people feel it more moving up their arms, moving up their legs, maybe exploding their heart out. But typically, classically, it's up the body, up the spine. And this is associated often with inner sounds and light perceptions. Sometimes it's like the white light of a mystical experience. Other times it's actually inwardly perceiving that the energy moving up the body is luminous, like there are currents of light moving up through the body or up into the brain. And this may culminate in a mystical experience, a psychic awakening, inspired creative experience, or as it did in me, I think my healing experience, that explosion of the light flowing in my brain, was actually the Kundalini currents, and it was a luminous light. I could see it flowing inwardly in my brain. So that's the fourth category. The next category is the psychic experiences. Now, psychic experiences are called siddhis in yoga, and they're very well documented. There's a classic book called the Yoga Sutras of Patanjali, which describes the various experiences of consciousness, experiences of consciousness that people go through as they're going through the spiritual transformation process. And these various psychic phenomena or psychic gifts are described. And psychic gifts or psychic abilities are not the purpose of the spiritual transformation process, which we'll get to later. But they go along with it. They tend to develop in people when they're in the spiritual transformation process. And some people get a little bit lost when they start developing a psychic gift, and they think, oh, maybe this is what I'm supposed to do. I'm supposed to really develop my ability to be a clairvoyant. And then they get off into developing the psychic ability rather than focusing on deepening spiritually and growing spiritually. So according to yoga, the purpose of the spiritual transformation is to grow and develop spiritually And along the way, yes, psychic abilities will very frequently come along. So what are some of the common psychic abilities that people will tell me about? Clairvoyance. Clairvoyance is an ability when you can see things that are beyond the normal range of thought. So you can see visual images. Like I saw my friend's brain covered in pus. That was a clairvoyant experience. I saw a visual image that was information beyond the normal range of thought. Clairsentience is when you can feel something, that you know something by feeling it. And you may feel it, for example, people who are highly clairsentient, and this, by the way, is very common, find that they start picking up on other people's emotions by feeling it as physical sensations in their body. So if someone's in a lot of mental turmoil, you might feel like this heavy pressure in your forehead. If they're really, really sad, you might feel this heaviness in your heart. And people who become quite clairsentient as part of their spiritual journey might sometimes find it difficult to be in crowded places, subway trains, where a lot of people are close to you because you're picking up on people's emotions. Sometimes you'll even feel their emotion, like all of a sudden you feel this rage, anger, rage going through you, and you go, where did that come from? That you're picking up clairsentiently on the anger of somebody around you. If that happens, I'd say move to the next car in the train. That person. Yeah, I've had that experience. Clairaudience is when the information comes not by vision, not by feeling it, but by hearing it. So that if you hear whispers in your head saying, stop the car, or turn left, or go to that lecture tomorrow, that if you're hearing it, and like what I heard, swim to shore, that was a clairaudient experience, that I was getting a message through hearing it. Telepathy is the phenomenon where people can transmit thought to and from each other. That some people have that ability as well. The next group, premonitions or precognition, you probably are familiar with this, but it's a psychic ability when people start to sense something that's about to happen or get a clear precognition of something before it happens. Past life recall. This is another very common and very interesting psychic phenomenon that develops in many people in the spiritual transformation process. And it can be challenging if you, in your worldview before this started, didn't believe in reincarnation and didn't believe in past lives. But these will tend to happen sometimes in dreams. You may have a dream that's really, really vivid and giving you like 3D action where you seem to be somebody else in a past life, having interactions that are often with people that you recognize as people you know in the here and now, but they're in a different form. They might not be the same sex, but you're having some sort of parallel problem in a past life to what you're having in this life. We seem to meet these people we have unresolved business with, and we're still trying to figure it out and come to peace. Sometimes it'll happen by going to a physical place, like if you go traveling and you go to, let's imagine someone told me they went to Egypt, and then when we went to Egypt, it was like, oh, suddenly having memories, images of themselves having lived in that particular place. And sometimes it'll come by meeting a person, that you meet a person that you have this inexplicable, really strong attraction to, and then all of a sudden you start getting images of yourself knowing this person in a past life. So this is all very common in people who are in the spiritual transformation process. The next one is out-of-body experiences and astral travel. They need very little explanation. The difference between the two is in an out-of-body experience, your spirit or your point of perception stays within view of your body. But with astral travel, you go somewhere else. Maybe you go to another room, you go across the country, you maybe go to another planet, you could even go to another dimension or to another time. So your spirit is going somewhere else and no longer in view of your body. Telekinesis and telepyrokinesis. What telekinesis is when, someone could turn their phone off, please, thank you. I can't do that kinetically. Telekinesis is when your aura or your energy field moves objects. And sometimes you can be in control of it, and sometimes you're not in control of it. I mean, I've had it happen to me when I was in an extremely stressful situation with a number of people were there who had very negative, a very negative history with me, were very wanting to harm me. that as I was standing there just trying to be calm, be peaceful, all of a sudden the coffee mug jumped off the table beside me. And clearly it was my energy that did it. I was not trying to do that. And I mean, there was no earthquake that made the coffee cup jump off the table beside me. But I understood that my energy field was very agitated, trying to contain this tension, and it made things around me move. There are a lot of documented cases. Carl Jung also had telekinesis happen to him, the very famous psychiatrist. Telepyrokinesis is when, with the ability of the mind or your aura, that you start fire. So there are people who have this ability. It's not just horror movies on TV. It's quite rare though. And another one I want to mention here that is somehow related is electrical pulse sensitivity syndrome. So this is people this is also frequent in people who've had near-death experiences, where your aura, for whatever reason, tends to fritz out electronic equipment and make light bulbs pop, and the microphone suddenly doesn't work, that the security code at the gate is voided when you walk through. That this is something else that unusual about the energy field around people in the spiritual transformation process. The next one I've listed is healing abilities, and I would also call this the recipient of healing abilities. That another psychic phenomenon that tends to develop in people as they're going along the spiritual path, spiritual transformation path. The next group, automatic writing, communication with spirit guides, and channeling. So automatic writing is a phenomenon where it seems that another spirit or entity actually takes over the hand. So the person who's doing the writing is not in control of what's happening in their hand, and that this spirit seems to be writing through their hand. And there may even be very different handwriting style from what the individual this is happening to, what their handwriting style is. Communication with spirit guides, this is again a very, very, very common phenomenon for people in the spiritual transformation process, and it can happen in a lot of ways. Some people experience communication with spirit guides visually, like they can actually see their spirit guide. Sometimes they see symbols that their spirit guide is putting a big Y in their mind's eye, which means yes, or a big N, which means no, or a big stop sign, which means no. Other people hear their spirit guides, that they hear guidance from their spirit guides. Some people can even smell or feel the presence of their spirit guide around them. And then other people, what's the one I'm leaving out? Hearing, did I say hearing, seeing, feeling, touching, touching. That others will get sensations in their body, that a light feeling might mean a yes, go ahead with that, and sort of a heaviness in their heart or a heaviness in their head is the way that they experience their spirit guide telling them, no, this is not my path for me. So again, this happens a lot to people on the spiritual transformation process. And channeling is a different phenomenon where it seems like the consciousness of the individual who's acting as the channel disappears for a while, and the consciousness of a disembodied spirit is speaking or talking or writing through that person. Materialization, stigmata, and bilocation. These are other psychic phenomena that are well documented, but less common, and sometimes only in more advanced, spiritually advanced individuals. So materialization would be the ability to materialize physical objects and or your own body when you weren't there before. So a very graphic experience of materialization that we probably all know is that of Jesus Christ, who materialized his body many times. But interestingly enough, when you look in the yogic tradition, there are other great saints who had this ability to materialize their body. And there are some saints around today. Sai Baba is quite known for materializing physical objects, just being able to materialize objects. So it's quite rare, but it does happen. Stigmata is another psychic phenomenon, and I relate it to materialization because out of nowhere, people get wounds on their body that are bleeding blood in the sites that mimic where Jesus Christ's crucifixion wounds were. And usually stigmatists are in a profound mystical experience where they're re-experiencing the Passion of Christ while these materializations happen on their body. So I'm not saying we understand these phenomena, I'm just listing them for you because they occur, so that we can have names to describe some of these phenomena that occur. And the last one is bilocation, which is also quite well documented in the yogic tradition. Some great saints that perhaps were meditating in, let's pick a city, Calcutta, and that they materialized a physical body, and at the same time, the exact same time that it was known by witnesses that they were there in Calcutta meditating, they were in Delhi, speaking to a group of disciples. And so, yes, there are a lot of interesting types of psychic phenomenon that have been documented. And the last thing I want to mention here is trans-dimensional psychic experiences. And I do not consider myself a UFO expert, but I have had a number of patients come to me over the years who've had UFO experiences, and I have spoken with many UFO experts. And I believe that a large portion, I'm not saying all, but certainly some of the UFO encounters that people are having are trans-dimensional psychic experiences, because the after effects they have are very similar to people who've had other psychic experiences. So if you have a psychic awakening and you've awakened one of these abilities, let's say clairvoyance or clairsentience, you tend to have more of those experiences, the more of that same type of experiences. Again, it's like that channel has been opened in the brain. So people who have these UFO encounters find themselves after the UFO encounter, usually the two types were the small monk-like UFOs and the upside-down pear-shaped type UFOs, they find themselves open to a lot of psychic experiences afterwards. So why would they have a UFO encounter and then afterwards all of a sudden their psychic centers are blasted wide open? To me, that's because I think these are trans-dimensional psychic experiences. So, next category. Oop, we missed one. There we go. Inspired creativity and genius. So this is a powerful STE that has a mystical or paranormal component, but also has inspired creativity as a really big central feature of it. And this can be inspiration for writing, it can be inspiration for music, it can be inspiration for art, the sciences, psychology, philosophy. And several great mystics of the past that are quite well known had very marked inspired creativity. One is Hildegard of Bingen. I don't know if any of you are familiar with her, but she composed music, she drew art, she invented herbal remedies, and she was a great mystic, having profound mystical experiences. So she was an example of a mystic who had a strong component of inspired creativity. More recently, Paramahansa Yogananda, the founder of Self-Realization Fellowship, I don't know if any of you are familiar with him, but he wrote a prolific number of books, incredible volume of books, bridging Christianity with yoga, showing how all religions are under the same one God. He wrote music, he wrote poetry, so he had a strong inspired creativity component. And interestingly enough, some people that are known mostly as geniuses also had strong mystical experiences. So one of them was Einstein, and another one was the composer Brahms. And I have more examples of these in my book, but this is another category grouping of spiritually transformative experiences. I want to mention here that, before I start with near-death experiences, that many people, after they've had any type of spiritually transformative experience, find their creativity increased. So that they may start writing poetry if they didn't write poetry before. They may have the urge to draw if they didn't draw before. But that's, I would say, a normal increase in creativity that somebody has who's going through a spiritual awakening. The STE is when it's combined with a peak spiritual experience. So I would say my healing experience was also an inspired creativity experience, because the creativity awakening was a really, really key part of it with the white light experience. Now let us move on to near-death experiences. So hopefully, this being ChicagoIANDS, most of you are familiar with the near-death experience. So I'll just very briefly go through this. That a near-death experience, according to researchers in the field, including myself, has basically two components. It's an out-of-body and or white light mystical experience. And secondly, it occurs when you're clinically dead, close to death, or psychologically facing imminent death. So, therefore, if you have a close call, like you're driving down the freeway and you almost had a head-on but nothing happened, and woo, it scared you. Many people today are calling that, boy, I had a near-death experience on the freeway today. It is not a near-death experience if you did not go out of body, have a life review, have a white light experience, nothing in that spectrum. It's called a close call or a good scare. It is not a near-death experience as we are defining it in IANDS. And similarly, if you have a profound out-of-body experience and or a white light experience, which is very similar to what people had in near-death experiences, but it does not happen while you're close to death. It happens when you're maybe meditating or sitting in your room at night or looking at a beautiful sunset. Then, by classic definitions, that is not a near-death experience. It's a mystical experience, or it's an out-of-body experience. Just as valid an STE as a near-death experience, but it doesn't meet the criteria for a near-death experience. Now, according to Raymond Moody, there are about 15 features of near-death experiences. Most near-death experiencers have about 7 to 10 of these features. I have all this listed in my book. I'll just run through them real quickly. This hopefully is review for most of you. But near-death experiences, they have an ineffable quality. That means it's a feeling experience that much of it is beyond words. Auditory awareness means that while your body is dead or unconscious, you have memory of accurately hearing what people were saying around your dead or unconscious body. Then there's the strong feeling of peace. So the fear of dying, the fear of death just disappears, and a strong feeling of peace takes over. Then there are often unusual inner sounds, and this can be described as ringing of bells, tinkling sounds, sometimes it's a rushing, sometimes it's a roaring, sometimes it's even like a zapping, like an electrical current, zap, zap, zap. So it can be various sounds, but often there's an inner sound associated with a near-death experience. Then the going out of body experience. Not experienced by everyone, but many people have the out-of-body experience at the start of their NDE. Then the dark tunnel, again, not experienced by everybody, with a white light generally at the end of the tunnel, and meeting spirits or beings of light in the journey up the tunnel or at the end of the tunnel in the light. And these will sometimes be spirits of departed loved ones. They can sometimes be spirits that we don't know who, or they can be angelic figures, or they can be spiritual archetypes from your particular faith tradition, or sometimes an archetype from a different faith tradition. Some people have a life review, as I did in only one of my 4 near-death experiences, where you seem to re-experience or learn lessons from some of your life experiences. Then the life barrier, where you can't go any further or else you're going to die. Abrupt return to the body, and all of my near-death experiences, they were all very abrupt return to the body. And then afterwards, absolute conviction of the reality of the experience, and also very clear memory of the experience. There's something about the memory of near-death experiences, it's like it's etched in your consciousness. If you were to ask me, what I had for dinner or what I was wearing on these various days that I had my near-death experiences, I couldn't tell you, I wouldn't remember that. But my experiences are etched in my memory by some paranormal means. The transformational impact of near-death experiences is another feature. It changes people. it changes people, and it changes them in many ways. It changes them psychologically. A lot of people finally grow up after their near-death experience. They abandon self-destructive habits like smoking or excess drinking, or abusive language, or whatever issues they need to deal with. Spiritually, it changes people. That comes in the next one. They lose their fear of death. They have more compassionate views about various faiths, that we're all children of the same one God. And then psychically, it changes people. It opens people to psychic experiences after having a near-death experience. Then the next one, it stands alone, is new views on death, that people lose their fear of death once they've had a white light. This is for the white light near-death experiences. And they have the knowing that the spirit lives on after physical death of the body. Not the theory, not the thought. They have the knowing that the spirit lives on after death of the body. And the final feature of a near-death experience by Raymond Moody's list is independent corroboration. And what that means is that things that were observed while out of body were corroborated by other people afterwards. So there are a number of other death-related STEs that I'm listing here. One is deathbed visions. This happens also to a dying person, and generally within a week or two, or sometimes hours before they die. And this is, as I described to you, that happened to me before my head injury in 2003, where it seems like the veils get thin. And before they die, the person may start talking to spirits on the other side, or you see that they're looking sort of onto the other side. They may tell you, sometimes it comes in a dream, that, oh, my departed husband came to me last night in a dream. And they seem to sense when they have this experience that they're going to be dying soon, and they generally tend to lose their fear of death once they've had this deathbed experience. They know who's going to be welcoming them, and it's going to be okay. Terminal lucidity, when people suddenly, a few hours before they die, their medical condition seems to disappear, and even though they had dementia, all of a sudden they're able to speak clearly, and they recognize their loved ones that maybe they had not recognized before. I think it's somehow related in this whole thing of deathbed visions. So I cluster them all together under deathbed visions. Then there is another, the last two are experiences that do not happen to a person who's dying, but they happen to you and me when somebody else dies. And death watch experiences, I talk about this in my book, and I've been writing about it since 2000. These are paranormal experiences that happen to you at the time of somebody else's death. And it happens most frequently if you're physically beside the person who's dying. But it can also happen if you have a bond of love connecting you with somebody you love who dies on another part of the planet. And death watch experiences can happen a lot of ways. Sometimes, one that happened to me was when my grandfather died. I was sleeping in Canada, and my grandfather died in Switzerland. I had no idea he was even in hospital. And while I was asleep, all of a sudden in my sleep, I got a clear visual image of my grandfather's face. And he didn't look like how I ever knew him. He was a luminous, white face, and he looked young. I'd never known my grandfather to be a young man. But I saw my grandfather's face. He looked young, he looked radiant, and then it disappeared from view, and I woke up from my sleep, and I thought, my grandfather's died. And I got the phone call a few minutes later that he, in fact, had died in Switzerland, right around when I had that. Many people have described experiences like that at the time of a loved one's death, whether you're close to them or far away. Sometimes it can be a physical sensation. Someone that I mentioned in my book told me the story about, she was at home washing her dishes one evening, and all of a sudden she doubled over with chest pain, and she thought, oh my goodness, what's happening to me? Am I having a heart attack or something? And then she got the thought of her father, and she wondered if her father was okay. And then the chest pain went away, and a few minutes later the phone rang, and it turned out her father, who had been traveling overseas on a trip with the mom, had a massive heart attack with chest pain and had died at the time that the woman felt the pain, the chest pain of her father. So Other times it can be hearing the voice. An interesting story that was told to me was by a paramedic, and he said that they were called to a car crash somewhere on some country highway, and a woman that was in the crash had been killed, and they had not been able to resuscitate her, and her brain was sort of hanging out in the roadway. I mean, it was really clear that she had died, and he was wrapping up her body. I think there's a bag or something that they have to put the dead body in, and all of a sudden he heard a voice in his head and said to him, "I don't know what's happening. What am I supposed to do?" And he somehow intuitively knew that this was the voice of the woman who had just died, who he didn't know, and he was at her side. And so he had heard about near-death experiences and the light, so he mentally said to her, "I think you're supposed to go to the light. Do you see a light around you?" And then she sort of was still and said, "Oh yes, I do." And so he said, "Go to the light," mentally. And then she disappeared. And he had held this story and not told anybody for a long time because he thought people would think he was crazy. And he said, "I've been around so many people who are dead or dying, but this was the only time I had an experience like this." Who knows why it happens sometimes and not at other times, but I call these death watch experiences. Another person told me on September 11th, which all of you know which day I'm talking about, where they were meditating, and suddenly it was like a force greater than himself took him, and he found himself in spirit above the site in New York, and that he intuitively saw all these spirits going up to the light, and he felt that he was called to help the spirits who were still hovering around the wreckage, that were confused and not knowing what to do, to help guide them to go up into the light. And so he didn't know these people. This is with complete strangers, but he just told me that he thought, because he was a long-time meditator, that Spirit just used him as an instrument that day, and that other people, he believes that other people were used as an instrument that day to help the confused souls to cross over. So I group all of these together into Death Watch experiences. Now, in my experience, Death Watch experiences is one of the most common type of STEs. So for curiosity's sake, I'd like everyone who's had a Death Watch experience to please put your hands up. A lot. This is at least half the room. At least half the room in here have had a Death Watch experience. So it is a very powerful and beautiful STE. And the other one, so you have the name, is the after-death communication. So the after-death communication is different. This is, again, you're alive, somebody has passed, but the one who has passed makes an effort to communicate with you. And that can happen in the form of a vision. You could see the visual face of that person appear to you. It could be in the form of their voice. You can hear them whispering a thought to you, like, "I'm here." Sometimes they'll do funny things, like their favorite rocking chair, all of a sudden they'll make their favorite rocking chair start rocking when you're there. Sometimes it'll be a scent. One woman told me all of a sudden she started smelling her husband's cigar smoke. And she thought, like, "Oh, no, I thought I threw out all the cigars, and I thought I cleaned all the ashtrays." But then she got it, that this was the way that he was letting her know that he was there. Sometimes it's even more physical, like a case in my book where the radio suddenly turns off when turns on when the family's in one room, so the radio in the next room turns on when nobody's there, and the favorite song of the person who had died is playing on the radio just when the radio comes on. So these are all different forms of after-death communications. And no, they're not crazy, they happen to lots of people. So, now that's back. Go away.
It's because you're bumping the mouse a little when you're talking.
Sorry.
It's okay. We love you anyway.
Thank you. So, as I continued working with people in the spiritual transformation process, I couldn't help but notice that these STEs start a long-term process of spiritual transformation. It isn't just, a few weeks or days or months of reaction afterwards. There's something long-term happening to people. And these changes are occurring on the body, in the mind, and in the spirit. And I go into great detail in this in my book, but today that's not going to be the focus. Today I'm going to focus on what is the goal of this spiritual transformation? Where is it trying to take us anyway? So as I looked at this, I started looking at the research to see, had any people written about this? What is the goal of this long-term spiritual transformation process? Well, about 100 years ago, the Canadian psychiatrist Dr. Richard Maurice Buck wrote this wonderful book called Cosmic Consciousness. And he postulated that this was part of evolution. That the evolution of the human species is not that we're going to grow another arm or a leg or a tail or something like that, but that we were going to have an evolution of consciousness, and we were all going to gradually expand the range of our consciousness to what he called cosmic consciousness, which would include mystical states of consciousness. Evelyn Underhill, who was a British mystic at the turn of the century, the last turn of the century, she wrote about mysticism, and she studied Christian mystics and the long-term transformation process in Christian mystics. And she wrote that she thought that the long-term transformation was leading to unitive consciousness. She called it unitive consciousness. We're all in God communion. Gopi Krishna in the 1980s, he added to this, and he said he thought evolution of the species was drawing everyone slowly and at different rates to an expanded range of consciousness, which he called higher consciousness. But he added to this the concept that this involves awakening in the brain dormant brain regions or functions. So he was actually talking about neuroplasticity before our doctors have started now in the last 5 years talking about neuroplasticity. So that he said that in time we would be able to, with our medical technology, be able to actually see that we're turning on currently dormant regions of the brain as people are having these STEs and having the long-term transformation. But he also postulated that there's a mechanism in the body which can speed the transformation process, and that energy is the activation of the Kundalini energy. And he said this was a real mechanism which by meditation and by right living can be activated and can accelerate this evolutionary transformation process. And in yoga philosophy, particularly as elucidated recently by Paramahansa Yogananda, but in classic yogic philosophy, it is held that the evolution of all humanity, that we are now in an upward yuga or upward age, and that eventually that all of humanity will reach an ongoing state of mystical consciousness. So I thought, okay, this is wonderful, but as a very grounded, practical, medical doctor person, it was such a long way off, and we're down here at the very beginning of the process. So I thought, are there models for the stages that we have to get through to get from A to Z? And I found that yes, there were a few models around. So Evelyn Underhill, she had postulated the mystic way, which involved the awakening, purgation, purification, visions and illuminations, dark night of the soul, and then eventually divine union. In yoga and Buddhism, they have the model of the chakras, which some of you may be familiar with, and the concept of working your way through upwards through the chakra system, purifying and cleansing the various psychological, spiritual issues that we have in the chakras until we can finally ascend to the crown chakra. And I, in fact, used to talk about the chakra model, and I had done that to IANDS in the past before my before my brain injury. But then around 2001, I found the model that I'm going to talk to you about today, which is purification of the heart. And I absolutely love this model. This was first written about by Swami Sri Yukteswar back at the early part of the century. So this is adapted from his work. I love the concept of purification of the heart because even though it comes from yoga, it's something that somebody of any faith can relate to, the concept of purifying the heart. So according to this model, there are 5 progressive stages that we will all go through at some point in our soul's evolution, in our spiritual transformation process. So I'm going to elaborate on all of them, but just so you know what the 5 stages are. The first stage is called the dark heart. So this is before you have your spiritual awakening. The second stage, which occurs after your spiritual awakening, is called the propelled heart. This is your stage of searching and learning and starting your emotional and psychological healing and recovery work. The next stage is called the steady heart. And this is when we commit ourselves to service to others. And we've also done enough searching, we commit ourselves to a spiritual path, and we go with that spiritual path. Then we get into the stage of the devotee, which is the next stage, the devoted heart, where there is intense yearning for communion and surrender of ego attachments is the big task. And finally, the clean heart, which is where we focus on deepening communion. So let's now look at these a bit more closely. The dark heart stage is unfortunately the stage that a large proportion of our planet is in right now. The dark heart stage is the stage before the spiritual awakening. And there's an absence of light, a lack of spiritual wisdom. The Kali Yuga, according to yoga, is the dark age, but where there is a lack of spiritual wisdom. The good news is we came out of the Kali Yuga around 1700, the time of the Renaissance. So according to yoga, we're now on an upward curve in terms of the evolution of consciousness in humanity. So that means that more and more people will be having spiritual awakenings according to yogic theory. But those that are still in the dark heart stage will have very strong material consciousness, that all that's of value or importance to them really is material. There's a lot of selfishness, there's a focus on sex, drugs, money, material possessions. Sound familiar? At this stage, there is denial of psychological issues, unaware of psychological issues. They don't think they have any psychological issues. They don't even believe in the concept of psychological issues. They have no idea what it is. So that is at the dark heart stage. At this stage, there's a lot of fear motivation, a lot of emotionality, anger. The lowest form of expression is in cruelty, evil. Religious dogmas, there's still a religious dogma, religions in the dark heart age, but there is an intellectual interpretation that is full of errors, full of mistakes. There's a much misunderstanding of the truth of the Holy Scriptures of any faith, and a general lack of love and compassion, even though love and compassion is in the Scriptures. And there's a lack of awareness of the deeper spiritual purpose of life, that we're souls, that we're here to grow and to learn and become more loving and to manifest the light on the planet, is not aware of that at all. So the propelled heart stage, now this is the fun stage, and maybe one that many of you are in right now. So the propelled heart stage happens after a spiritual awakening. We shift into the propelled heart stage. And this is the stage that we learn and we grow, we explore, we break out of the sort of bubble perhaps that we were raised in, the cultural paradigm that we were raised in, and we start looking outside the box and maybe dabbling in yoga or dabbling in healing, or suddenly we're taking Tai Chi, or now we're studying the Kabbalah, and people will learn from many different paths because you're exploring. This is normal in the propelled heart stage. And so you don't feel guilty about it if you've been following one path for a while and then Spirit seems to be calling you on another path. This is exploration. You know how a child learns? They try 7 different ways of putting the block in the hole. This is what's happening in the propelled heart stage, that we are exploring, we are learning. And this is the stage of the spiritual quest. And this was certainly true for me after my 1979 near-death experience in the plane crash that I told you about. I told you for the first 10 years, I was just doing this for me. I wasn't doing it with patients. I was trying to figure out what was happening to me. And I was learning from a lot of different spiritual traditions, different teachers, different books. And at this stage is also when people, if they hadn't started already, they begin their personal healing and recovery work. They finally get out of denial about their own emotional issues, and they start working on self-improvement. And there can be a lot of challenges in the propelled heart stage, because as you're changing, as you're growing, as you're breaking out of your old habits, you might not get a lot of support from your old friends or from your family who are not going through the same sort of change that you are. And it can be painful sometimes, because we might have to end some friendships, end some relationships that we would have preferred to have continued, but we're just at a different stage now than we were before, and it's called growth. So the propelled heart stage is a really long stage, and people may be in it for their entire lifetime, after a spiritual awakening. And that's fine, we need to search and learn and experiment as long as your soul needs to search and experiment. But what starts happening later on in the propelled heart stage is that the heart starts opening wider. And we discover that, my focus was very much on me at the beginning of the propelled heart stage, like I am learning, I am growing, I am healing. And then a shift starts happening because we realize we really need each other in order to learn and grow. And then it shifts from I to we. We are growing, we are learning, we together are going through this awakening. And people start getting more humble, less self-centered, because they realize they've got a lot to learn from the person sitting right next to them, and that they don't have all the answers within themselves. Now, according to yogic theory, this is typical of the age or yuga that we're in right now, which is called the Dwapara Yuga, or the electrical age. It is the propelled heart age. So they say that more and more and more people are going to be having spiritual awakenings, and near-death experiences is one of the ways people are having spiritual awakenings, along with the other types of STEs that I talked about. But the other thing that's happening in this age, according to the yogic model, it's the electrical age. So we're also learning, as we're awakening, about the electricities. So we're learning about outer electricities, but we're also learning about inner electricities. So this is a time that we're learning about the prana, or the life energy, or the chi, which flows through the body, and the meridians, or nadis, that it flows through the bodies, about the chakras, or the centers along the spine, where this life energy flows, about the kundalini, spiritual energy, Holy Spirit. We're also learning now about the energy body, about the astral body, energy healing. And if you think about it, those of you who are old enough, 50 years ago, this was all way, way, way out of the box. But even in the 50 years that have happened, and those of you who are younger, even in the last 20 years, that this has now become more mainstream. I was surprised 2 weeks ago while I was watching Jeopardy, one of my favorite shows. There was a question. The answer was, what is the energy according to yoga that lies dormant at the base of the spine, which can be activated through meditation? And the question is, what is Kundalini? And I thought, oh my God, we've made it onto Jeopardy. It's true story. So, anyway, so what happens towards the end of the propelled heart stage is the soul call to God increases. We've done a lot of experimenting. We've tried a bunch of paths. We want some clarity now. We want to know, what is the path that's really going to lead me further? Then we move on to the steady heart stage. So at the steady heart stage, we've now developed clarity about what our spiritual path is, and we commit to that spiritual path. So rather than, the saying is sampling lightly from a whole bunch of different wells, we find the one well that resonates with our soul, and we commit to drink deeply from that well. So to use that path and go deep with that path. So our spiritual practices become more important, but we're now committed. We're doing according to the path that resonates with our soul. The other thing that is a real hallmark of the steady heart stage is service to others. At this stage, we're really into the we. We want to help others. We want to be of service. This becomes a passion. People will make less money, spend less hours at work, making less money because they want to be of service to others. They want to do volunteer work. They have a need, a hunger, a strong urge to be of service to others that sometimes can be poorly understood by those around them who might not be at that stage. What do you mean you're only going to work 3 days a week now and make less money because you want to volunteer the rest of the time? Which is something that I did when I entered the steady heart stage. That happened to me after my calling mystical experience, where I knew that I was being called to serve others by talking about near-death experiences and STEs. And could have been, and I did deal with a bunch of flack from the medical profession and from the medical governing bodies, and I had to answer to this and answer to that, like, what does this have to do with the practice of medicine, and how is malpractice insurance going to cover you, and blah, blah, blah. But I dealt with that because my passion to serve was so strong. And that is typical when you get to the steady heart stage. So I'm not the only person who goes through that. So your heart keeps on opening through your selfless service to others when you're at the steady heart stage. But then sometimes after an NDE or sometimes with time, a shift happens. And for me, it happened with my 1995 near-death experience when I went into that period of 2-month communion afterwards. That I got it, my soul got it, that happiness for my soul didn't matter how many millions of people I helped. It was on the inside, not on the outside. That how I was going to be truly happy, how my soul was going to be truly happy was on the outside. Now, it doesn't mean that I stopped serving or that I stopped doing my emotional healing and recovery work. No, those tasks from the earlier stages continue. But it's now I knew that where I would find happiness was on the inside, through my meditation, through my relationship with God. So with that deep realization, surrender is embraced. So surrender is a huge part of the devoted heart stage, surrendering our attachments, because we realize we cannot reach that equipoise, that stillness in our consciousness, which is like the doorway for which we can get into communion. If we still have our likes and dislikes and we're all upset about what Susie Q did or what Joe Smith did, that this emotional rattling is keeping us from our true goal of equipoise. So we consciously embrace surrender and letting go. Thy will be done, not mine, becomes the mantra in the devoted heart stage. And dark night of the soul or ego death can happen in this stage. Which is like a bleak sort of blackness that happens. And if you think of it, like if you let go of everything that was ever important to you in life, but you've not yet reached that state of communion, there can be that sort of in-between place where it seems quite bleak, like what is there then? You know, what is there then? Have I made a mistake? So this is the stage that people will sometimes go through the dark night of the soul. So the thing to do, if this is happening to any of you, just embrace your love of God. Try to remember the light the best you can, even if you're not experiencing it, and trust that the darkness will pass, which it will. At the devoted heart stage, devotion increases. Now, a lot of people don't know what devotion is. I experience it as intense yearning for the divine. I wanted it so bad I could almost taste it. The yearning to be in communion, the desire to be in communion. And for me, the love of God, trusting God, desire to be one with God. Many glimpses can occur in the devoted heart stage. And as the devotee in the devoted heart stage is letting go, they become clearer and clearer, so they can become clearer and clearer instruments of the divine. We're almost done, and I want to make sure we have time for questions. Do we have to be out promptly at 5 o'clock? Without 10 minutes, okay. So I'll try to be a bit fast here, so we'll have time for questions. The final stage is the clean heart stage. Now, probably none of you here are at this stage, but this is the 5th stage in the purification of the heart. And the purification of the heart, as we reach this stage, we have completely surrendered. And we have had the ego death experience. And we start having periods of communion. And inner reality becomes more real, stronger, more important than outer reality. So the rest of the world thinks you're crazy. Some of the great saints and mystics of the past, you know, that they were being treated abysmally, tortured, put to death, whatever, but their inner reality was stronger than outer reality, and they just stayed in their consciousness, God, 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 I love you, God, communing with God. The goal at this stage is to go deeper and deeper into your ability to commune for longer and longer periods, because at first it's intermittently, but then later on in the clean heart stage, it becomes ongoing unitive consciousness. Now this is a very advanced stage. So this is now the stage of what I would call spiritual masters, who are in ongoing unitive consciousness while they're still functioning in the world on an ongoing, not temporary basis. So in my opinion, that would be like Jesus Christ, the Buddha, Paramahansa Yogananda, and perhaps today the Dalai Lama, I'm not certain. But this would be a very advanced state of consciousness, being fully in communion while able to function in worldly activities. And according to Yogananda, that even once you reach this level of ongoing mystical communion, the level of a spiritual master, that there are still 3 progressive stages, which he paraphrased from the Sanskrit into English as the first stage being Christ consciousness, the next stage being cosmic consciousness, and the final stage being God consciousness. Now clearly that's beyond my ability to talk about in any depth, but I wanted to share it with you just to realize what a long journey this is in the spiritual transformation process. And sometimes you'll see somebody who's maybe had one near-death experience or their first psychic experience or something, and they say, oh, I'm illumined now. And I would say, no. You're at the very beginning of this long-term transformation process. There's still a lot of steps ahead of you. But I think it's good to have a picture of the total picture. So, in summary, the 5 stages according to the purification of the heart model is the dark heart stage of the unawakened, the propelled heart stage after the spiritual awakening, then the steady heart stage where we're really passionate about service, do unto others as we would have others do unto you is your mantra there. The devoted heart stage, which is all about surrender, thy will be done, and the clean heart stage, which is about deepening communion. Be still and know that I am God. So, I think everyone should be aware of the stages because searching is normal when you're in the propelled heart stage. Serving others is central when you're at the steady heart stage. But be aware, psycho-spiritual house cleaning and doing your emotional recovery work and self-reflection is essential at all the spiritual stages. And anybody at any stage can have a slip and fall back to some of the issues of the earlier stages. And then finally, that meditation is the key to spiritual deepening for those of you who wish to deepen on your spiritual path. So I'm going to end there so that we have time for questions. My book is available for sale, I think still, if you're interested, or you can order it online. And I will now take questions for the last 15 minutes. Thank you. Oh, okay. At the back?
Yes, I have a question. During that period after you had your traumatic brain injury, was it hard for you to have a steady path in terms of keeping your faith and knowing where you needed to go? Was it can you describe a little bit more personally about what that felt like for you?
Well, I'm planning to write an entire book. My next book I'm writing is on my healing from the traumatic brain injury, so I have a lot to say on that. But basically, I never lost my faith in God, but there were times that, I was tested, and I wondered, why me? Why did this happen to me? But I would always keep anchoring on God. I had lost my ability to meditate, and I knew that meditation was absolutely crucial, so I worked very, very, very hard. It took me years to regain my ability to meditate. I'd say maybe 8 or 9 years. And then, but I worked very, very hard. I was committed to regain the ability to meditate. And then I had the healing. Yes?
Yeah, I'm curious. I'm listening, and it seems to me like this happened to you.
Yes.
You were chosen. In other words, you weren't going out and saying, okay, I'm going to become this, that, or the other thing. You kind of just fell into it. And it also seems that it requires a pretty traumatic, either emotional or physical experience to achieve these levels of enlightenment, for lack of a better term. Is that a fair statement?
Well, what I would say, how I've come to terms with it, I can't repeat the question, sir. How I've come to terms with the fact that I've had so many experiences is I look at it at this is the way Spirit showed me repeatedly that this was what my life work was supposed to be.
Swim
And-
to shore.
Swim to shore. And that also it was Spirit's design that not only would I be a researcher, a professional, a medical doctor teaching at a major academic university, but that I should be an experiencer too, that this was the divine design. And why me? I mean, there are other doctors now who are starting to have these experiences too, but that's how I put it together, that Spirit wanted me to be clear on what my life work was going to be, so kept giving me these experiences. Yes?
Are you aware of your past lives that relate to this present life?
The question was, am I aware of my past lives that relate to this present life? Yes. As I mentioned, when I had my 2003 near-death experiences, it was like the veil was lifted and I could see the pattern of many of my past lives and how it fit into the present. And yes, I've had STEs in past lives. Yes, indeed. Yes.
I was going to ask, excuse me, when you finally had the real near-death experience and you were there and things were shown, did you see anything about what's happening to us collectively that?
No, the question was when my last NDE in 2003, when the veils were lifted, did I see anything about what's happening to the planet collectively? Not that I can remember. It's possible that I was, but not that I have memory for. Yes.
Well, hi, Yvonne. Yeah, I'm really glad you're here. So, back in 1975, with the brain injury I told you about, I started to learn how to transcend, like the mind and 9 regions, heavens, mansions, whatever you want to call them. And because of the brain injury, and then me trying to explain to my family, 9 stepchildren, 1 daughter, 2 grandsons, sister, brother-in-law, that I can transcend the mind and go to the 9th region and stuff like that, all 9 regions. Besides the brain injury, besides the mental illness, besides the 43 years of vegetarian, I was considered crazy, with no jail sentence, no criminal record, but was locked up in nursing homes and hospitals for 30 years. And they thought I was really just
Yeah.
a loser. I was a loser then.
So I don't know how many of you heard that, but he was sharing how some of his STE experiences went because he had a traumatic brain injury, or maybe just because of the low consciousness of people around, were treated like he was crazy, like he was insane. Yeah, unfortunately that did. Hopefully that's happening less
But
and
I can
less.
still, my problem is, it gets so lonely for me sometimes. I think about loneliness and I'm really not, I can't explain it. I'm used to being married with kids. I'm not married anymore. I still got my kids, but deep down inside there is something missing, even though I know how to transcend.
Well, I would say meditate more, and then we'll take a couple more questions because we only have limited time. Yes. Yeah.
One of the things that I would like to know is, one of the things that really bothers me is all the suffering of children on this planet and also the ecology. And lots of times I feel like I can do it the best I can as a person, but I feel like collectively we all need to really care more about that. And I just was wondering if you had any thoughts about how you deal with the level of suffering on this planet and
Okay.
still be here.
The question was how I deal with or reflect upon the amount of suffering that's on the planet.
Especially children and beings.
Especially children, yeah. And I think a number of things. Well, first off, the soul is immortal, and that once we die, it's like the suffering disappears and we lose memory of it. So that's nice to be aware of. Secondly, that maybe it's there to help growth. That to encourage those of us who aren't suffering to develop our compassion and our willingness to help other people, and maybe the person who's suffering is also experiencing some profound spiritual growth through that. So there could be a lot of levels to it. Okay, yes, you. Yes, you.
On that point, how would you describe your process of grieving in all of these experiences and in your work with other people too? You know, I'm a psychotherapist, so, you know, just where does grieving fit in, and how is that best spiritually held and surrendered to?
Okay, I personally never experienced grief except for after my traumatic brain injury. So I did go through a grief process, even though I had the certainty and the knowing that there was good in God's plan, that I suddenly lost all these abilities I used to have, the career that I loved to do. And I mean, I loved helping people, I loved serving, I loved writing. And so I did have to go through a grief process about that. And but I found for me, personally, I think I moved through it quicker than most people would move through a grief process because of the powerful near-death experience. Because I absolutely knew that God's plan is good. I didn't understand it. I didn't know why, but God's plan was good. But on a real human level, yeah, sure, I had to cry. I went through anger. You know, I went through times that I was drawing pictures and going, why me, why me? But it was all, because I too worked as a psychotherapist, I knew I had to allow myself to go through this. You know, that it's not because I've had a near-death experience that I wouldn't experience grief or loss. I did. But then, okay, God, you know, I've had enough of the pity pot. I'll pull my socks up. Yes, back there.
Yeah, thank you so much. I was very excited that you were coming. I'm a physician also, integrative medicine, psychiatry, Ayurveda, homeopathy, all those things.
Wonderful.
Yeah, and one of the things that I come from a family of physicians, and I treat physicians' kids, and I work with all ages. And one of the things I'm finding myself struggling a bit with is how do I take these spiritual experiences, and you know, people in my practice get soul retrievals and things like that, but how do I explain this to this very sort of pathology-oriented, somewhat secular, agnostic or whatever model of science that we have, where people are so pathologized, especially with children and young adults, and I work with all the ages. So I'm just wondering, being a physician, being in the science world and the spiritual world, how to work with that? Because I have clients right now who have sort of dissociative experiences and psychotic experiences that are called psychotic, but I see it as parts that have left and gone to the other realms for a while, that they can be integrated. But I'm trying to explain this to their doctor parents. So I was just wondering if you could help me with it.
Well, I would say start by getting a copy of my book, have it in your office, and that you can lend it out if a colleague of yours has a patient that you think has had a, you know, let's just say a near-death experience, for an example. Say, this is a good book. You might want to read the section on near-death experiences. It's written by a doctor. Read it real well. I spoke, before my brain injury, I spoke a lot at medical conferences, and I found that the door in was through spirituality and healthcare. I actually found in the Spirituality and Healthcare Network in Canada that there's a growing interest in terms of cultural sensitivity, being sensitive to people with different faiths, faith traditions, but spiritual experiences also connects with that. So by linking with spirituality and healthcare, or maybe having a network that's open to spirituality and healthcare, and then you have your laying on of hands healers, etc. This was a way that I found it easiest to sort of interface with mainstream medicine. And actually, before my head injury the year before, I proposed to the University of Toronto to do their very first conference on spirituality and healthcare from a multi-faith perspective. And they did it, and it was a resounding success. And we had both spiritual leaders there from various traditions, from Native Indian to Buddhist to Muslim to Jewish to Christian. And then we had all sorts of healthcare professionals, doctors, nurses, social workers, physiotherapy, people who were into laying on of hands. And that was at a mainstream university, and I think that's the way to do
I
it.
guess my question is, I feel like those people are more reachable, because they're interested, but I find it harder to reach people who are calling themselves secular or atheists.
Yeah,
You know,
and so I think start by talking to those that are receptive,
Right.
and it reaches out, and that's be what I would recommend. Start with those that are more receptive.
So we've actually had, near-death and life experiences ourselves. So
Wonderful.
the first-hand experience, like they're describing, is so helpful, and really appreciate your being here.
Thank you. Over here.
First, I'd like to thank you for your presentation. It's one of the best I've been to
Thank you.
in my life.
Thank you.
And also, I'd like to know what your thoughts are on the role of organized religion as a step to developing spiritually.
Okay, organized religion, that was an interesting question. I don't know if everyone heard it. What I think about the role of organized religion in its role in developing spiritually. I think it can have an important role, and I think it can have a positive role, but I also think sometimes it can be a hindrance, and it depends very much on the particular situation that you're in. I know some people, one person I know who had a very powerful mystical experience. Once he came to terms after reading my book that he realized it was a mystical experience, he found that he could talk, he's from the Jewish tradition, he found somebody, I think he lives, I'm not sure where he lives, but who's into the Kabbalah, who understood mysticism from the Kabbalah. And for him, that meant a lot, because he was within the Jewish tradition to find some support within his own spiritual tradition. So sometimes that can happen and it's really helpful. But other times, and like what happened to me, I was raised in a Christian tradition, I found that in my particular church community, I was invited to speak to my church community, but the sort of comments I got was, do you realize 100 years ago you would have been stoned to death for saying that? And yes, I am aware that 100 years ago I was stoned. And so there was sort of a closed-mindedness. So for me personally, I had to move, although I still consider myself very much to be a Christian yogi, but I don't fit within that particular church that I was raised. I had to go outside to find a Christian yogi path that agreed with me. Yes, over there.
Yes. A lot of people who've had spiritual experiences within their family, they become, the person, near-death experiences, has had a very open heart. And when there's no children involved, with their spouses, they see a different path. And a number of times, it's wound up in divorces. Do you have any guidelines of how a person with an NDE and has an open heart to keep that loving relationship that used to be established?
That is a wonderful question. I talk about this a little bit in my book, so you might want to get a copy. But it's always an issue in a relationship, in a marital relationship, if one person is growing on a different rate from the other person. And it is a challenge. I'm not going to pretend that it's not a challenge. Ideally, hopefully, with the amount of love that the person who's had the spiritual experience is now capable of having, they can be patient, they can be understanding, they can give their loved one who doesn't believe in their experience or doesn't support their experience and certainly doesn't share their experience, unconditional love, and move into a different type of relationship, maybe from what they had before, one where they shared things more, to one just of understanding that they're in a different place. Doesn't make the experience or closer to God or better than the person, you're just at a different stage in your spiritual path. Now that's ideally speaking, but I think there's been some good research that NDE experiencers have a high divorce rate, and I in fact am divorced. My husband one day said, Yvonne, you need someone more spiritual, was mine. And, but I haven't knew somebody. Okay, I just, all right, go ahead.
I ask this of a lot of people. How are we going to attain peace on earth?
How are we going to attain peace on earth? I'm going to say through the grace of God and much, much passage of time.
All right.
There was another question over here, yes.
How did losing the patient on the plane in the 70s affect you?
The question was, how did losing the patient in the plane affect me?
Oh,
It did affect me.
poor.
I knew in my heart that we had all done everything we could to save her. And I felt certain that she was fine. I felt certain that she was in the light, that her spirit was in the light. So I didn't feel sort of the normal, oh, I failed her or whatever. I felt more that this must have been somehow in the divine plan, that 3 of us survived. And with all of our efforts, we could not pull her out. And, but yeah, no, I expressed my, I apologized and expressed my condolences to the Native community at a later date that I was not able to save her. Yes?
Talk about the passage of time. You said that the Renaissance, the 1700s, was a new
The
time
new
period.
Yuga, the Dwarf or
When
Yuga.
is the next time period?
According to Paramahansa Yogananda, different yogic traditions say different things, but this Yuga is 1,200 years, the electrical Yuga.
2900?
1,200.
I know, but it's 1200 from 1700.
Yeah, for 1,700, so we're already like 300 or 400 years into it. Do we have, is there one more question?
I have a question.
Oh, one more gentleman, yes.
In your opinion, can any drug, including alcohol, LSD, whatever, contribute or supplement or have an effect on having a mystical or spiritual experience?
The question was about drugs and their relationship to mystical experiences. Some of you may remember Timothy Leary, who talked about LSD, and then there's others who talked about psilocybin, magic mushroom, etc., inducing mystical experiences as part of their possibility. From what I've read and heard and speaking to people who were part of that generation, my understanding is occasionally, and then there's the Indians in South America who also take some hallucinogenic, I'm not quite sure what it's called. Ayahuasca, yeah. So that sometimes it seems in some people it might be helpful, but in many, many cases it's not. And my recommendation is not to use hallucinogenic drugs, and my recommendation is to meditate, work on your self-development, develop your love of God. And then the last thing is I want to mention, since you brought it up, about marijuana and about alcohol, and even tobacco, that they seem to have a dampening effect on the spiritual process. And so generally as people go along the path, it's almost intuitively within themselves realize that they have to stop smoking, they have to stop doing pot, and they have to stop drinking alcohol, except for maybe a little glass at a wedding or something like that. Yeah.
I want to interject one quick thing here before we stop, because people are beginning to leave, and there must be someone in this audience who has a car, who plans on coming back next month, and who would be willing to take the coffee pot.
I already volunteered.
Oh, she did. God bless you. Thank you. Don't go back. Now we can proceed to thank Yvonne Kason for being here today. Oh, yes. We are truly blessed to have you today. I've been working on this project ever since I went to the other side in '95 and read her book then. So it's truly a gift, and we are very grateful that you came. Thank you.
So you remember, these were really good.